Okay, Ling 441, we're going to move on today and we're going to start talking about respiration and pulmonic airflow to kind of think about the foundation that we use for all pulmonic aggressive sounds in speech. Okay, so I guess I'll preface this with a couple of comments. Number one, I adapted these notes from a chapter on in this book called Normal Aspects of Speech, Hearing, and Language from Thomas Hickson. This chapter itself was called Respiratory Function in Speech. It was written a while back. 1973, actually the year before I was born, if you can believe it. But the world hasn't changed that much, so it's still a good primer for how all this stuff works. And the second thing I'll say is that there's a lot of terminology and just kind of like basic biological details in this lecture, just so you know what the equipment is and how we use it in speech and breathing in general. So normally when I give this lecture in class, I write a lot of these terms on the board so that you can write along with me. And because I think, and in fact, I feel like I know that if you write something down when you're taking notes, you're going to remember it a lot better than if you don't. That doesn't make as much sense now that I'm delivering the lecture this way, but you can, so I mean, basically the information is in the notes if you want to look at it and look it up. You can find it there. But if you want to remember it, doing something like writing it down might help you a little bit better. Obviously, you're not going to need to write it down because you can stop and pause and rewind this video as many times as you want, given the way the world works now. But just so you know, if you want to remember those details, you're probably going to have to take an extra step to do something to help you remember it a little bit better than just watching this video passively. Okay, so let's get into it. Like I said, or something we learned in 341, is that all speech sounds require airflow, and we've talked a little bit about how the acoustics of that works in this class as well. And also something we learned in 341 is that the vast majority of sounds in the world's languages use a pulmonic egressive airflow, which means that we're pushing air out of the lungs. So the pulmonic part of this is the part that means the lungs, and egressive means out of the lungs. That's the way the air is flowing. So in this lecture, we're going to kind of address three different questions by the time we get to the end of it. One is the most basic question, which is how do we make airflow out of the lungs? We kind of know the answer to that a little bit from 341. You might want to think about what answer we talked about in that class before we get to that answer in this lecture. Number two, how does pulmonic airflow differ in breathing and in speech? And then lastly, how does pulmonic airflow relate to language? And the way it relates to language is primarily going to be through these suprasegmental features that we've been talking about heretofore, things like stress and changes in F0, so on and so forth. So our goal is to get answers to these questions by the time we're done with today's lecture, and I have a feeling we're probably going to get there, at least in some fashion. Okay, like I said, there's a lot of mechanical details in this lecture. So let's start off with the equipment that we have to use when we're breathing. Actually, I'm going to take a step back and do something else that I normally like to do in this lecture as well, which is to have you take the deepest breath you possibly can take, and then also breathe out. Once you get to the sort of peak of your breath, and breathe it all out as much as you can possibly get out of your system, and then kind of revert back to normal. Yeah, so let's just do that now, just for kicks. I'm going to do it. I hope you do it along with me. Okay, see how far you can push it there at the end. I maybe didn't give it all 100%. Maybe it was more like 95. But try to get to like the limits of your system, because it actually kind of feels good when you take a deep breath like that. And it helps you get in tune a little bit with what's going on inside your body when you breathe as well, which is something we've kind of maybe all had to think a little bit about, more about in recent days with all this respiratory illness going around that hopefully none of us ever have to suffer unduly from. Okay, so what did we do? What were we playing around with? This is the human torso, which is the part of your body from the neck to the legs, basically. So it's everything, including these sort of five external pieces, your head, your arms, and your legs. That's your torso, and you can subdivide that into two major divisions. The top part is called the thorax, not the thorax, it's the thorax. And this is basically the chest area, including your heart and your lungs. And it's surrounded by your rib cage, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. That, as you can kind of see from this diagram, is split off from the second part of your torso, which is called the abdomen, or if you want to get non-fancy about it, it can be called the belly as well. So there's this muscular structure in between those two called the diaphragm, which splits up or subdivides the torso into these two parts. The abdomen has a lot more than just two major organs in it. It's got a lot of stuff. It's got, your stomach, your intestines, and gallbladder, and so on and so forth. But it's basically includes digestive system organs and other interesting glands to help you process all the food you need to get energy, right? Okay, but it also gets involved in breathing or respiration. So yeah, thorax, abdomen, chest, and belly. Thorax, like I said, includes the heart and the lungs, the top part of your torso. And these organs are, number one, super crucial, right? They enable us to get oxygen into our system and pump it through every part of our body through the circulatory system in the form of blood, right? So these are surrounded by the rib cage, which is kind of like a form of flexible armor for these super important organs. So these obviously your rib cage includes the bony structures of the ribs, but it's also a little bit flexible too because it has these gaps in there so that when we expand and contract our lungs, the rib cage is going to get a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller as we do that because it can kind of take advantage of the gaps in between the ribs to expand and compress. The ribs are connected by cartilage to the sternum, so that's the bony the bone in the middle of your chest right here, leading straight down. And there's cartilaginous parts sort of connected to it right where the ribs kind of link up with it, which also kind of helps, I think, give it this sort of flexibility. In those gaps in between the ribs, there's actually muscles so that there's not some, clear gap through your body. Which is obviously useful for other reasons. So those are filled up by muscles called intercostal muscles. So the intercostal is another technical term. Pretty sure this comes from Latin because the inter part means between and the costal part means ribs. So this just means these are muscles between your ribs. And you can kind of see it in this diagram here. They're filling in these gaps. And they will also cover the surfaces of the thoracic cage. So they're kind of on the inside of the rib cage and they're on the outside of the rib cage. Technical term for the rib cage is thoracic cage. I think you can see where that comes from based on the word thorax. Okay, so the thorax, like I said, is split from the abdomen by a dome-shaped structure known as the diaphragm. So this is the muscle down here, and it kind of curves down on the sides and is relatively flat or can be made flat on the top. But your lungs are going to sit on top of this diaphragm. So you can also kind of change the shape and size of this a bit when your lungs contract and expand as well. So it's not just changing shape and size on the outsides in terms of the rib cage. Within your body, your lungs are going to change shape and size too. So one thing that's interesting about this system is that connecting up the lungs themselves to the ribs are these two structures known as the pleura. So there's one called the visceral pleura. It's a membrane, basically, which covers the lungs. And then there's also the parietal pleura, which lines the inside of the thoracic cage. And there's some fluid in there as well that helps these two membranes kind of slide past each other as you're expanding and contracting the lungs. So you can kind of think of it like this, I guess, where one of these is on the inside and one of these is on the outside. And, that kind of basically provides you with some lubrication and some flexibility to expand and contract the system. There is a condition which is also another respiratory illness you don't want to get. It's called pleurosis, where you get an infection or inflammation of these structures, and it can become quite painful, apparently. So if you've ever read or seen the play The Glass Menagerie, there's the main character in that play had pleurosis when she was young, and suffered from it, and it still kind of hurt her self-confidence when she was an adult. But that's besides the point at this point. She got the nickname Blue Roses from that. And this is, up till a couple years ago, we probably thought that most infectious diseases were mostly in the past. Now we know better. But I used to tell a story that pleurosis is still around. So there's a famous baseball player for most of my adulthood named Ken Griffey Jr., who was amazing, but apparently at some point in his career he got not pleurosis. He got pleurosis, not blue roses, and it knocked him out or sidelined him for quite a while. So watch out for that. But we know what to watch out for now in this world, at least a little bit better. So that's just so you know. These things are useful, but slightly vulnerable too. Okay, so this is what links up the lungs to the ribs, the pleuri. But basically, the thing to remember is that there's a connection between the lungs and the ribs so that they can work together. So kind of what's interesting about this is that the lungs, because of this connection, are bigger than they would be on their own if you just left them by themselves. I don't know when we're going to be able to get back into the cadaver lab over at the hospital to take a look at like the organs of speech again. Hopefully in the not too distant future, so you get the opportunity to do it or see that if you want to. But in that tour, they generally have a pair of lungs. Actually, they usually have two pairs of lungs sitting on the sideline somewhere. One is like a pair of smoker's lungs, which do not look good. And then there's another pair of just kind of non-smoker's lungs, which look a lot better. But you get to see the actual size of the lungs. They're not super huge, but or at least not as big as they are in your body itself, because by connecting up with the ribs, the rib cage actually makes them bigger. It kind of pulls them out a little bit, bigger than they would be by themselves. The rib cage, for its part, is smaller than it would be on its own if it were just left to kind of expand to where it wanted to be. This is a diagram from that chapter I mentioned before at the start of this lecture, which kind of shows you how this works using the analogy of springs. So if the lungs are a spring relatively tightly coiled like this, they would not drop down that far from like the ceiling, only to this point. If your ribs were a spring, maybe a little bit more loosely linked together, they would drop all the way down to here. You put them together and they meet an equilibrium point. It's closer to where the rib cage wants to be by itself than to where the lungs want to be by itself. But it's somewhere in the middle, right? If the two are together. But then because they're springs, they're going to have some leeway going in both directions. Like you can kind of think if you like pulled down on a spring, it would kind of bounce up and down. Do I have my slinky? I should have my slinky. Well, I don't have my slinky. Maybe I'll show it to you at the end of this video. I have no idea where it went. Yes, I do. Never mind. Right? If we have a slinky, it has a little bit of equilibrium in it, right? But there's a point at which it naturally wants to kind of tend to if I'm just holding it without any tension, and it'll get there eventually. Okay. Fun with children's toys. Okay, we've talked about that, so let's take a step back now that we know a bit about how the basic machinery works. Let's remind ourselves of what we learned from 341 again, that when you have any sort of sound, you need to have air flowing in from one direction to another. And particularly what air will always do is flow from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. That's just automatically a given. And you can think about this again. I said we're going to talk about how breathing works just in general and apply that to speech by saying that most speech sounds that we find in language are going to be pulmonic egressive. So we have sounds flowing out or based on air flowing out of the lungs into the world around us. So if you think about that a bit, that means that we're going to have higher pressure inside of our lungs than in the world outside of us, because that's the way the air is going to want to flow, from high pressure in here out to the lower pressure in the surrounding area. How do we make those air pressure differences? We talked about this in 341. We take advantage of Boyle's law. And Boyle's law states that the pressure of a gas in a chamber is going to be inversely proportional to the volume of gas in a chamber. So we don't, in a sense, control the pressure of the gas directly. What we control directly using the equipment of our body is the volume of the gas in the chamber, because we can make those lungs bigger or smaller using various muscular actions, which we'll talk about. So we're going to either decrease the volume of the lungs or the chamber of air inside our bodies, and that will increase the pressure of the gas, the air inside of us. If we expand the volume of the lungs, then the pressure of the air inside of our lungs is going to go down. If you have basically the same amount of air and you reduce the amount of space it can occupy, that pressure is going to get higher. It's like squeezing people even tighter into an elevator or something like that. And if you expand that room, then there's more space for the molecules of air to move around in without bumping into another one. So the pressure gets lower. Excuse me. Yeah, so decreasing volume increases pressure, increasing volume decreases pressure. That's what Boyle's law says. So when we start breathing, like we did with our example breath at the beginning of this lecture, that big breath you took in, that what you have to do to that is increase the volume of your lungs. That will decrease the pressure, the air pressure inside your lungs. So air will naturally flow in to your lungs from what is now a higher air pressure area outside of your mouth, right? It's not changing out here at all. You can kind of just change its relative pressure by changing the air pressure inside your lungs. So I think we've walked through the steps of that. And of course, the inverse happens once you lower the volume of your lungs in that same breath cycle. But we're going to talk about how inspiration works first. How can we expand the lung volume? It works actually in all three dimensions, which is convenient because we're three-dimensional creatures, at least spatially. And there's two primary muscle mechanisms to make it happen too. So let's walk through those, and then we'll talk about expiration or breathing out afterwards. Okay, so the vertical expansion of the thorax, or the lungs, is primarily going to be driven by the contraction of muscles in the diaphragm. So this is a helpful diagram because I think this is something that's kind of easily confused, or at least I was confused about it when I was a kid, and I learned about this in music class. So we used to, sing out loud back when it was okay to sing around in the presence of other human beings, and we would. Our music teacher would say, like, use your diaphragm. So I always had the sense that, like, if I pushed harder with my diaphragm, I'd get, like, more volume or air out into the world around me, right? That is the exact opposite of what is actually happening. So your diaphragm is, like I said, this dome-shaped kind of structure in the middle of your torso. This is what it looks like when it's basically relaxed. And what we can do with muscles to activate them, we contract them. So to activate them, they get tighter. And if you tighten up this structure or contract it, contract means it gets shorter, right? So the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. That's what happens to your diaphragm. It stops being a dome-shaped structure and it just starts being a straight line-shaped structure. What happens to the lungs with that? I'll mention that point in a second. What happens to the lungs is there's more space all of a sudden on the bottom of the thoracic portion of the torso, right? So this dome goes down. The lungs themselves can expand in this direction as well. And there's an interesting other side effect of this, which is that the contraction of the diaphragm is actually going to push out your entire torso and abdomen as well, which is kind of funny. So you're breathing in, and this will kind of make sense for that reason. If you want, this is part of what's making the whole volume of your thoracic cage bigger. But it's kind of hard to think of this maybe in terms of the diaphragm, that you're pushing out your belly as well. And maybe I can try to demonstrate that here. I don't know how well you can see this, but if I just take a big breath in, this belly portion should stick out a little bit, maybe. You can see that, I don't know. You can try it on yourself at home. Maybe it's a little easier to perceive when you can, rub your own belly. Okay, so the diaphragm contraction, like I said, is also going to, this is actually a new point. It's going to elevate the lower ribs as well. So on the sides, those are going to pop out a bit. And that will kind of expand the thorax in the side-to-side dimension, or all the way around, rather than just top to bottom. So we're getting a lot of bang for our buck out of this. This is kind of the primary mover of breathing in, or inspiration, because it's a big muscle and it affects a lot of things in various dimensions and makes a big change in lung volume. If you want to make more fine-tuned adjustments to lung volume, you can, at least for breathing in, you can contract the external intercostal muscles. So these are the muscles filling in the gaps between your ribs on the outside of your rib cage. And normally when we go into the cadaver lab to look at the bodies, the people who used to be speakers, we can see their external intercostal muscles pretty easily. They wrap all the way around the ribs, and if you contract them, what it does is it kind of, shortens up the space in between the ribs from the outside, and so it's kind of shortening them here and also kind of picking them up a little bit away from the sort of center of your body. And that is also going to have like a chain effect where it's going to lift up, if you contract, say, this set of muscles, going to lift up that rib, and that's going to in turn lift up this rib, and so on and so forth. So you get this knock-on effect where you're lifting up basically the entire rib cage from the top down. It will also pull each rib forward a little bit with the sternum, the bone down the middle of your chest. So you're going to get expansion a little bit in the front to back dimension going through me here, and then also a little bit on the side to side. The contraction of the intercostals elevates the lower ribs more than the upper ribs. This is because of that kind of knock-on effect you get from one to the next. So you can think about this as lifting up your lower ribs like a bucket handle. Unfortunately, I don't have one, but if you're like going to the old wishing well with a bucket full of water, you can think of like one of those old oaken buckets that you might use at your grandparents' place. That kind of bucket handle, right? Or maybe if you're just like washing the floors in your own suburban home. Either way, that's how it works. So this gives you a bit of expansion in the side-to-side dimension. So there's ways to expand in all three dimensions here, right? Flip side. So expiration, or breathing out, air flows out of the lungs whenever air pressure in the lungs is going to be greater than external air pressure. And again, we're going to get that by contracting the volume of the lungs. How do we do that? Before we get into it, actually, I'll take a pause here and give you another technical term. The air pressure inside the lungs is technically known as the alveolar pressure. This is the same sequence of sounds as another term we know in phonetics of alveolar, which is a place of articulation for specific consonants. It has basically nothing to do with that. The alveolar the reason we're using alveolar here is because at the sort of, well, actually I think I can go back. I think I have a little diagram of this somewhere. Yeah, the passageways into your lungs. There's a main one, the trachea, which we've talked about before, and then it splits into two different bronchi, one for each lung on both sides. And then those passageways split into smaller and smaller, more diverging passageways through the structures of your lungs until at the very end it winds up with these little sacs, which are called, each one is called an alveolus, and in plural they're alveoli. And if you want to refer to them in an adjectival form, it's alveolar pressure. So these are kind of the sort of whatever gas chambers at the very bottom of the system that have to like fill up with air and also contract to get rid of the waste product of respiration, which is carbon dioxide. And they also kind of like enable the transfer of oxygen to the blood system, right? That's where this word comes from. That was a pretty long digression. You don't really need to know all that. I just don't want you to be confused. And of course, it doesn't really hurt to know that either. But don't be confused. This is alveolar pressure. It has nothing to do with the ridge behind your upper teeth. It just is a way to refer to air pressure inside the lungs. So you can increase alveolar pressure, as we've mentioned before, by decreasing lung volume. And the interesting part of this is that you can decrease lung volume through both passive and active forces. And actually, the default way to do it is through passive forces, which is kind of nice because we kind of are able to do work without actually having to put any effort into it. So normally, if you breathe in and then breathe out, your lungs are going to contract due to passive forces alone without putting any muscular effort into that. Maybe you can feel that. Just actively breathe in and then just kind of let go. And the system, it turns out, returns back to where it wants to be at that equilibrium volume between the lungs and the rib cage without you having to contract any muscles at all. So this is sort of like, pulling this whole combo down. You make it bigger, right? You increase volume to breathe in. So normally it's hanging like around here, and I pull it down, and I don't have to actually push it back up to get the spring to go back up, right? It's just going to come back up by itself because it has that natural equilibrium that it wants to get back to. That's exactly what your lungs and your rib cage do too. If you expand them, they're going to naturally come back to where they want to be by default. And the technical term for the pressure that pushes the lungs thorax combination back to that point is called the relaxation pressure, which is nice. It's always fun to relax, right? It's also nice that the relaxation pressure works both ways. So if I were to take this little coil spring and push it up, then it goes back down as well, right? I get that for free too. So that's like, if I contract my lungs, I don't have to put any effort into them expanding again to get back to that equilibrium. It's just not normally how we breathe, right? We could do it though. If I want to actively expire, if I want to actively breathe out, then I have to get a variety of different muscles involved to make it happen. This is unfortunately a little more complicated than the muscles which get involved with inspiration, but these enable us to survive. So let's take a moment out and appreciate what they do for us. So what we want to do is lower the ribs and or sternum, and that will help us compress the thorax in the front to back and side to side dimensions. Basically doing the opposite of what we did before. To get the diaphragm to go back up to that dome shape, we can't sort of uncontract it back to that. We have to actually push it up using other sets of muscles. So if we increase the pressure in our abdomen, that's going to push the diaphragm back up to where it was when we began. Okay, so those will kind of counteract what we did before. The thoracic cage itself can be compressed by contracting the internal intercostals and the transversus thoracis. Let's start out with those. Maybe the easiest one to understand are the internal intercostals. So these are going to do the exact opposite of what the external intercostals did. They fill in the gaps between your ribs on the inside of the rib cage. So if you contract there, it's going to kind of pull the rib cage back towards the middle of your body. And it's also going to counteract exactly everything that the external intercostals did and kind of lift everything up instead of pulling everything or lift everything back in and rather than pulling it back out. The transversus thoracis is a muscle that is linked up here. I believe that goes back to between your sternum to the rib cage. So if you can think about that, it's kind of shortening the distance between your ribs and the sternum itself, and that's also going to contract the size of your thoracic cage, hopefully for fairly obvious reasons. These are going to pull the ribs downward and counteract the action of the external intercostals. Okay, so internal intercostals and transversus thoracis. For the bottom half of this equation, how do we increase pressure in the abdomen? These are kind of more important because, like I said, the diaphragm was like the big mover for inspiration, so we got to have something working together to be a big mover for expiration. So there's actually 4 muscles here that I'm going to talk about. There's another one that can be added on later, which I'll show you in a diagram. So, excuse me again. This is in part what your abdominal muscles are for. So these are called the rectus abdominis. Yeah, they're doing more than just making you look good when you sit by the pool in the summer. They actually help you breathe out. So this string of muscles running up right through the middle of your abdomen, if you contract those, that length is going to get shorter. So that's going to give you some contraction in the front or top to down dimension and maybe a little bit front to back as well. There's also the external and internal obliques. Here are the externals, and they're linking up here to the bottom of the rib cage. This is the internals. They look, I think, link up to the hip bones there, and then also somewhere in the middle, and then also the transversus abdominis, which simply kind of wrap around your entire abdomen. If you can think about it, if you contract all of these, it's kind of compressing the volume between your ribs and these other bony structures at the bottom of the torso, like your hips. And also kind of, if you contract this one that wraps all the way around, obviously that's going to make everything smaller in both dimensions, wrapping around your entire abdomen, right? So everything that makes your abdominal space smaller inside your body is going to increase the pressure inside the abdomen and drive that diaphragm back up. That's in turn going to make the volume of your lungs smaller and help push air out of your lungs by increasing the air pressure inside your lungs. In addition, that's going to pull down the sternum and lower the ribs, so on and so forth. Everything gets smaller down there, and you breathe out. Okay, I think I will, because I've talked quite a bit about this, I'm going to pause here because the next point is a little bit subtle, and I want to walk through it in some detail. So to make this video not too long, I'll pause and then make another video, and hopefully we'll just have two for this particular lecture. Okay, so I'll see you again in a minute.